差唔多啦，係嘛？請幾位講者望一望後邊啦。好，我諗差唔多啦，唔該晒。
It's about time. Thank you.
唔該晒，唔該晒。
Friends from the media, thank you for attending this press conference in the afternoon. The Chief Executive will first speak before answering questions. Because of the pandemic, please maintain social distance. Without further ado, we will first hear from the Chief Executive. Friends from the media, members of the public. In order to establish a set of systems that is in line with one country, two system, that is taken into Hong Kong's situation and implements patriots administering Hong Kong. Shortly before, there was a decision made by the NPC, and the NPCSC has been empowered to amend Annexes 1 and 2 of the Basic Law, namely the method for the selection of the Chief Executive and the method for the formation of Electoral. On the 30th of March, the NPCSC has endorsed the amended Annexes 1 and 2. In the two annexes, compared to the older version, you will find specific details. However, there are still some provisions that are left to the Hong Kong SAR government to provide for via local legislation. I'm very happy to announce here that this morning the Executive Council has endorsed the Improving Electoral System Consolidated Amendments Bill 2021. We have got the consent of President of the Electoral to convene a special council meeting tomorrow. The special meeting will allow the government to have the bill read the first time tomorrow. It's a very short period of time from the NPCSC to endorse the amendment of Annexes 1 and 2 to today when the bill is in place for presentation to the Electoral. It is a very short time, thanks to the endeavors of various parties. First of all, I'd like to thank the NPCSC for their work in the amendment of Annexes 1 and 2. They have provided very clear and specific details of the matter. A lot of the details have already been stipulated in the two annexes. All we have to do is to reflect these details in local legislation. I'd also like to thank the Secretary for Justice and the Secretary for Constitutional and Mainland Affairs for their participation and their leadership of their teams to work days on end to make this happen. I'd also like to thank the Department of Justice as well as the Policy Bureau for their hard work. The bill is gazetted today. It will be read the first time tomorrow. This is the Improving Electoral System Consolidated Amendments Bill 2021. This is a rather complicated bill consisting of different amendments. There are over 500 pages in the Chinese version and 600 or so pages in the English version. Altogether, 8 pieces of principal legislation will have to be amended. 5 of them have already been mentioned by me earlier on in Electoral because they encompass a rather extensive area. These are the Election Committee Ordinance, District Council Election Ordinance, Elections, Corruption and Illegal Conduct Ordinance, Chief Executive Election Ordinance. There are also 3 other pieces of legislation. However, the amendments are rather simple. They are the High Court Ordinance, the Court of Final Appeal Amendment, as well as the Travel Industry Amendment. There are also about a dozen or so subsidiary legislations to be amended. One of them is in relation to the gravity of the epidemic last year. So the EXCO has to make use of an emergency regulation to postpone the election of the Electoral to the 9th of September this year. But it looks like that the general election of the Electoral is not going to take place on that day. So the subsidiary legislation to be amended under this consolidated bill includes this one. The general election date of the Electoral will be changed from the 5th of September as set down last year to the 12th of December this year. So it's changed from the 5th of September to the 12th of slip of tongue is the 19th of December. My apologies. This is a rather bulky bill. We thought that we would be able to make use of the online version of the papers uploaded onto the Electoral website for perusal, but we're unable to do that, not yet. So I'm going to go through the content of the bill. We've also handed out a leaflet. This is a layman's guide or an easy digest to this bill. You can read this leaflet together with the previously produced booklets. You will get an overview of the details of the legislative amendment. But allow me to go over it. There are 2 major areas. First, to implement the amended Annexes 1 and 2 of the Basic Law. The second part is not directly related to the 2 annexes. We see that in recent years there is room for improvement of our public elections. We would like to take this opportunity to improve these areas before the upcoming 3 elections. We include relevant legislations and subsidiary legislations in this amendment exercise. First, I will go over the part related to the amended Annexes 1 and 2 by the MPCSC. There is one provision in both annexes. It says that there are areas that will be left to the Hong Kong SAR government to implement by local legislation. This includes the following areas. First, to designate certain organizations. You may recall in Annex 1, the EC, Election Commission, will be changed from 1,200 members to 1,500 members, from 4 sectors to 5 sectors. In each subsector, there are different ways to generate members of the subsectors. Basically, there are 3 ways. First, holders of specified offices in designated bodies as ex-officio members. The second area is those nominated by designated bodies. And the third way is election by eligible voters. They are either corporate voters or individual voters. So we need to define a number of parties in the 3 ways. In some areas they may not, or bodies that may not be official members, so we need to explain to you who can be ex-official members and who can be nominating bodies. The second part is in relation to the geographical election of the Electoral. There will be 20 seats in the geographical constituencies. So there is the delineation of geographical constituencies. It is reflected in this bill.
We're going to be dividing Hong Kong into 10 constituencies, which are shown in the bill itself. Basically, we have 450 sub-districts in the district council election, and we put them together, and on average, we have 600,000 to 800,000 electors in each district. There are 10 districts. Hong Kong Island, there are 2, 3 in Kowloon, and 5 in the New Territories. The third part of local legislation is the nomination in Annexes 1 and 2. As regards the number of nominations and where do they get the nominations, they are spelled out very clearly, and we are just reflecting these in the local legislation. The fourth area is the voting method. We have different voting methods. For the 40 seats arising from the EC, there's going to be a block vote. In other words, in the 1,500 strong EC, all members can elect 40 members. So this is a block vote. They have to select the 40 candidates of their choice. They cannot select any more. They cannot select any less. They will be selecting 40 candidates out of the list, and that will be the eligible ballot. And the 40 candidates who obtain the greatest number of votes shall be returned in the election. The second is more conventional, which is very familiar to all of you, and that is first past the post. And that is applicable to the functional constituencies. And this will adopt the first past the post voting method. As regards geographical constituencies, there will be a change. The voting method will be double seats and single vote constituency. There are 10 constituencies, each returning 2 members, and the elector will be casting 1 vote. The 2 candidates who obtain the greatest number of votes shall be returned in the election. The fifth area of work for local election is the ECRC, the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee, and this committee will be assessing and validating the eligibility of candidates in the CE, EC, and electoral elections. So there will be national security vetting. It doesn't say the composition. The composition will be handled through local legislation. So in the bill, regarding the establishment of the CERC, Candidate Eligibility Review Committee, there will be a chairman plus 2 to 4 members to be appointed by the chief executive. And only principal officials stipulated in Article 48(5) of the Basic Law are eligible to be appointed. They will be, these are the officials nominated by the chief executive to be appointed by the CPG, and they will be sitting on this committee. I'll be going into this in greater depth later on. In the 2 annexes, that they require the Hong Kong SAR to regulate any acts that will be manipulating and undermining the election. So we will be amending the Election Corrupt and Illegal Conduct Ordinance. There are 2 offences added. First, in the course of election, any person openly inciting voters not to vote or to cast blank vote or invalid votes, this will be an illegal conduct, or any person who willfully obstructs or prevents any person from voting at an election will commit a corrupt conduct. For further details, I'll be pointing you in the right direction in identifying the areas in the bill. So basically, Annexes 1 and 2 require the Hong Kong SLG to legislate locally. Second, this is proposed by the SAR government. It's got nothing to do with the Annexes 1 and 2, and this will facilitate the public election and make them more efficient and fair. In 2019 District Council election, we saw that there is a need for special queuing for electors who are in need, and the presiding officers will be setting up a special queue for voters in need of assistance. Now, who are the people who are in need? The senior citizens are those above the age of 70, pregnant women, and persons who are likely to suffer physical discomfort or suffering when queuing up to vote due to illness and so on. And the presiding officers can make special arrangement for queuing in this regard. The other area, which is also discussed a lot, and that is we are proposing the adoption of an electronic poll register. When a voter turns up at the polling station, at the moment they have the paper-based electoral roll, and you have to present your ID, and they have a ruler to cross out your name on the electoral roll, and people feel that this is not sufficiently good. And in the bill, we are amending the arrangement so that we can adopt electronic poll register in future election. Once ID check has been conducted, the ballot can be distributed. For a large-scale election, there are so many polling stations and also counting stations. As you all know, these polling stations are designated at public places of the stadium of an LCSD and schools, and the election normally takes place on Sunday to facilitate schools to loan out these facilities. The day after the polling day will normally be a holiday. To facilitate easier identification of these polling stations, the chief election officer can ask the owners of certain premises to let us use the facilities. And these are government schools and government premises. We will not be mandating the private premises to do so. And we're talking about the organizations that are subvented or funded by the government. We hope that they will be letting us use the premises. There were some litigations about the inspection of the electoral roll. In this amendment exercise, we want to enhance the inspection and compilation of the registers of electors. And Permanent Secretary is only too delighted to let you have more details later on. Election expenses. We have seen inflation over the years, and we would adjust the election expenses in accordance with the inflation level. So the inflation means that there will be a 10% adjustment to the ceiling of election expenses. The last amendment is the aspiration of those who have taken part in the elections. If there is an election petition, the financial assistance would be held in abeyance until such time as the petition is over and done with, before the money would be dispersed to the candidate. Sometimes the petition would take an awful long time. We've heard from some candidates that the money should be dispersed earlier. So in this amendment exercise, we will do away with this arrangement. We don't have to wait until the election petition is over before the financial assistance is dispersed to the candidate.
That's more or less what I have to present to you. But of course, there is more than that in the bill. Sometimes when you change one thing, there will be consequential amendments elsewhere. If you have time to read the paper we have given to the Electoral, you see that we have presented the papers in a certain way. By topic, say, voter registration, we explain to you what are the legislative amendments for easy comprehension of this bulky consolidated bill. We have completed the drafting. Tomorrow it will be presented in Electoral and then for the Bills Committee to scrutinize. We have heard some comments. We might not be able to incorporate these newly received comments in the bill. But we do take on board the 2 points we have received. First, in relation to the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee. This is a newly established body to assess and validate the eligibility of candidates, especially in relation to statutory requirements of upholding the basic law and swearing allegiance to the Hong Kong SAR. This is more vigorous than leaving the task to a returning officer. Principal officials will be the members of the committee. We've heard that there are opinions saying that it may not be partial enough. I take on board that view. So shortly afterwards, we will propose an amendment in the Bills Committee to add people from our society to join this committee. Of course, there will be principal officials, 2 to 4 of them, and we will also add people from the Hong Kong society to join as members of this committee. The second opinion we have received is in relation to timing. We have a lot of work to do. From now to March next year, we have to amend the various ordinances. We have to start the electoral process. There is no time to lose. The original voter registration period is 2 weeks. Well, for people who are not yet voters, they will have 2 weeks or so to register. But we've heard that since there are numerous amendments to our electoral laws, especially in the subsector of the election committee, we will extend the voter registration period at the expense of the time left for us to do the rest of the work. You see a date on the 5th of July. Voter registration will be opened all the way to the 5th of July. There will be about 4 weeks to do that. But that is different from the current regular voter registration that ends on the 2nd of May. Well, if you are not yet a voter and you would like to become one, then please register as a voter before the 2nd of May. Well, if you read these matters and you realize that you are actually eligible to become a voter in the subsector of the election committee, then please vote before the 2nd of May to become a voter. After that, they'll be able to proceed to the special voter registration for the subsector and the functional constituency to the 5th of July. Of course, we will have to allow time for appeal for the compilation of provisional poll register and then the official poll register. I can announce that we have set the dates for the 3 general elections. For the election committee subsector election, it will take place on the 19th of September this year. For the 7th term of the Electoral, as I said, after the amendment, it will take place on the 19th of December. For the 6th chief executive election, it will take place on the 27th of March next year. But we have amended the emergency date of general election 7th term of the electoral regulation and changed it from the 5th of September to the 19th of December. That's all for my presentation. I'd like to thank the subcommittee on improving the electoral system in Hong Kong, Chairperson Mr. Martin Liu. After the bill is presented tomorrow, we hope that the bill will be passed by the end of May so that we can complete the 3 general elections. We will fully cooperate and dovetail our work. We will provide information asked for. We will be more than happy to attend all meetings called to scrutinize the bill. I'll pause here. If you have any questions, I myself and my 4 colleagues will be happy to answer. The information and the bill has been uploaded to the dedicated website of the CMAB. Now the floor is open. Please raise your hand after your name's been called. Identified your organization and your name before asking questions. We'll limit the number of questions to 2. The lady in black. I'm from Wenwei Pao. First question. There are a number of government officials who have held briefing sessions with various sectors. What will be their major work in the future? And the 10 constituencies, does it change the operation of the old way? Will it affect the operation of your governance or the operation of district councils? I'll ask my colleagues to answer about delineation of geographical constituencies. After the 30th of March, principal officials and government officials have altogether attended 117 briefing sessions with various sectors in society as well as some internal ones, because civil servants will have to fully grasp the importance of our exercise this time. The next stage is to explain to the public. That is very important. We have to do it by stages because at each stage, the focus is different. In the first stage, we have to explain to the general public why we have to do it, why the central authorities will have to make a decision on a national level by the NPC, and then ask the NPCSC to amend Annexes 1 and 2. I see that our work has been quite effective in the past 2 weeks. The general public are of the view that the chaotic situations we've seen in the past 2 years has to stop, so that the Electoral and the government will be able to focus on livelihood issues and issues that are pragmatic. Starting from today, we will begin the second stage, which is to explain this bill. I've spent 30 minutes to explain the bill. I believe that whether it is in the Bills Committee, whether it is media interview, blogs, we will present the details of the bill to you.
As to the stakeholders who are affected, the functional constituencies of them have been changed. We do have the obligation to explain to them in detail. So these will fall on the bureau secretaries. I'm sure that they are making appointment with the different sectors to let them know about the formation of certain sectors and all the eligible voters and so on. All these work will go on. And this will continue until such time as the bill is enacted. The third area of explanation is pretty specific, and that is the voter registration. We have extended the registration period to the 5th of July, but still we need to explain the situation to the public and make convenient arrangement for the members of the public to remember to register themselves before the deadline. The next phase is the election. The September we see the first election. We have more seats and more sectors. So many who otherwise have not been involved would be taking part, and we have to make sure that they understand the electoral ordinance, particularly those in relation to the illegal conduct and bribery and so on. We will do a lot of explaining. In the fourth phase, we will be explaining a lot of the details to the voters, and also the candidate and their teams. Roy? The delineation of the geographical constituencies. Thank you, Chief Executive. There will be 10 constituencies in the whole of Hong Kong. The principle that we adopt is the same as the principle adopted by the EAC. We will not be severing the districts and we will also have regard to the even distribution of population. Normally, when delineation of constituencies takes place, there would be consultation by the EAC, but given the tight timetable, we cannot do this. So when we delineate the geographical constituencies, we will fully adhere to the EAC's principles. If you look at Appendix H of the electoral paper, you get to see that in each and every constituency, we will not exceed 5% of the total population. And this is very close to the principle of the EAC. This will not affect the work of the 18 district officers. In the 18 administrative districts, only 3, because of the population distribution, will have to be changed. There's Sha Tin Yuen Long and Wong Tai Sin. All the rest of the administrative districts will not be changed. Next, please. Other one in white at the back, please. Ming Pao Daily. About the CERC, the members will be principal officials under 48.5 of the BL, Commissioner of the Police and Customs and Excise and so on will be among them. Are the ranks commensurate with the power of the CERC? You said that there will be someone from the community to be added to the CERC. Will this person be appointed by the Chief Executive? And on what criteria do you adopt for appointment? Also, the blank ballot. What is the criminal liability and how are you going to be enforcing the law? Let me take the question about the CERC first. And the DOJ or the SJ can take the question about the blank ballot. CERC, under the bill, the Chief Executive will appoint the chairman and 2 to 4 members. The chairman and the members are the principal officials under Article 48.5 of the Basic Law. Now, these are the officials nominated by the Chief Executive, appointed by the CPG, and they're not restricted to the secretaries, and there are other people involved. That the CRC is responsible for the national security vetting. The National Security Department of the Police will be conducting the review, and they will be looking at the information, and the principal officials do have the ability to conduct the review, because these two, as you mentioned, are members of the National Security Department, the Customs Excise Chief and the Police Chief. They may not necessarily be appointed. We don't specify the post to be appointed. So the Chief Executive will have regard to the principal officials and the sphere of work that they undertake and other considerations when making appointment for the official membership of the CRC. Now, we said that there will be unofficial members from the community. As to the criteria for appointing people from the community, it would be like the criteria that we adopt for committees, like the integrity, the ability of the appointee. Now, this appointee is going to be sitting on the CERC, responsible for the review of the selection of the chief executive. So this person must be a patriot. And it would not be hard for us to identify someone who can fulfill these criteria. I'm sure that this person must be held in high esteem in the community and this person will be able to assist in the CERC work. SJ. For Annexes 1 and 2, we need to take measures to regulate any acts that manipulate or undermine elections. We have to stop people openly inciting voters not to vote or to cast invalid votes. So under the bill, we will be prohibiting these kind of acts. We don't really want to see anything done to undermine the elections. Now, these include making any form of communication with the public, and we can detect or observe certain acts in public, or the transfer and dissemination of certain materials to the public. Now, these are public open activities. The bill also provides that if a person has some reasonable excuse, then this can become a defense in the ordinance. So this is indeed to stop people openly inciting voters not to vote or to cast blank vote or invalid votes.
Next question. The one in black on the far right. I'm from CCTV. Good afternoon. I have two questions. First, just now you mentioned about number of briefings attended by government officials. We're very interested in that. In relation to these briefings, what influence impact does it have in our society? What outcome have you achieved? How will you actually implement these new amendments decided by the NPCSC? Thank you. The Hong Kong SAR government is of the view that the improvement exercise is very important to our constitutional system. The central authorities have, on a national level, done a lot, of course. We have to actually proceed with the various general elections, so we have to do a lot of work to implement these details. The first stage of our work is that based on the amended Annexes 1 and 2 on the 30th of March by the NPCSC, we have organized over 110 briefing sessions attended by government officials. Majority of them are for the general public, and some of them are for internal use. Why do we do it? I've attended some of the briefing sessions. The response is that they fully agree that there is a need to improve our electoral system. They have seen the chaos in our electoral in the past 2 years. A lot of people are simply fed up with it. So they are very grateful that the central authorities have actually taken action to improve our electoral system. Well, I've heard about some concerns as well. That's why I have already said that I have heard these additional comments, although they are not incorporated in the bill, but we will propose amendments to reflect these amendments. First of all, is the extension of voter registration, because there are some great changes in some of the voter eligibility, so we need to give them more time. The second area is in relation to the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee. Given Hong Kong's situation and sentiment, if members are just principal officials, maybe the perception is not ideal. But I can assure you that principal officials are impartial and just. That when in the scrutiny of the bill and at later stages, we will propose to introduce additional members to this review committee. Overall, the response from the general public is positive. The second stage of our work is local legislation. In general, that is done in the Electoral. Very shortly, a bills committee will be set up to scrutinize this bill. We aim to have this bill passed by the end of May. But if Hong Kong people don't support our work, it will not be very meaningful for us to pass the bill. So we need to explain to the public. Principal officials, directors will make use of all the platforms available to explain to the public. When we proceed to conduct the three elections, as to how to proceed with the three elections, it will be an actual implementation of all these amendments. We're very confident that we will be able to achieve the goal and conduct the three elections properly. Next question, the one in a dark top.
Explain why is it a problem for people to, to encourage others not to vote in an election as a form of protest? And what are the penalties for people deemed to have incited others to cast blank votes? And secondly, could you tell us what is the basis for carving up the original 10 geographical constituencies, 5 constituencies into 10 constituencies? And also you said you're going to appoint some new members from society to sit in the vetting committee. But even so, wouldn't there still be a conflict of interest, given that your cabinet members and people appointed by you will still get to choose who can run in the elections? Thank you.
Maybe I'll invite the Secretary for Justice. I can't remember the penalty.
I'm also looking. I can't
because there are over 400 clauses in this bill. So let us find out for you the penalty for the two new offenses under this consolidated ordinance. The reason for introducing two offenses in this exercise, of course, stem from Annex 1 and Annex 2. In fact, most of the things that we are now doing in the local legislation is to fully and accurately implement Annex 1, Annex 2 as approved by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. That is the starting position. So in both annexes, we are required to act in accordance with the law to prevent any acts that is amounting to manipulating or obstructing elections. So in Hong Kong, based on the experience that we have had over the years about elections, we have identified these two aspects that we should do something in law. One is when during the election period, when there are certain activities by certain people which are intended to incite people to not to cast a vote or to do something strange in the elections, then it will be an offense. But as the Secretary for Justice has explained, and I will draw your attention to that particular clause, I think it's clause 366 in the consolidated bill, that there are certain defense that any person could deploy. And there's also well defined what is an activity. If you do it behind closed door amongst yourself and a few friends, that perhaps will not be an offense. So I would suggest that you go through that particular provision in the ordinance to understand how somebody will be committing an offense under this proposal. The reason why is because one is we have to implement the National People's Congress Standing Committee. The other is, of course, we all want elections to be very fair. So any manipulation to jeopardize or sabotage an election should not be permitted in a situation like Hong Kong. Now, the second question is about the carving out. Again, this is a decision made in the National People's Congress Standing Committee when the number of directly elected geographical constituency members in the Legislative Council is down to 20. And we are required to look at how we organize district-based elections in Hong Kong and try to come up with these 10 districts each to return 2 members into the Legislative Council. So an easy way to do it is to merge the much smaller constituencies that made up the district council elections, and also taking into account the size of the population. So Mr. Roy Tang has already explained to you that we are following the established rule that is within a range. It will not have a district which is too huge, too large, and another one which is too small. So that is the basis. As far as members of the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee, now you have to accept that under the current election regime, this job is already done by a public servant, actually a civil servant, in the name of a returning officer. He or she, appointed during an election, has the sole discretion to decide whether a candidate fulfills the requirements for a candidate. If not, the candidate will be disqualified by the returning officer. So the current proposal, of course, it also stems from Annex 1 and Annex 2, but it has elevated this whole arrangement to consider the eligibility of candidates to a committee rather than an individual, to a group of principal officials who are accountable to the people of Hong Kong for their acts, who are not unknown people, okay? So the legislation will provide for a committee to be made up of a chairman and 2 to 4 members, and all of them have to be principal officials appointed by the Central People's Government under Basic Law Article 48(5), because this is such an important job. And hence, I have decided, because this matter is being left to Hong Kong. It is not designated or specified in Annex 1, Annex 2. Having regard to the objective of this exercise, I have decided to propose in the legislation that it will be made up of principal officials. But in the last 2 weeks, whenever we talk about this eligibility review committee, there was a school of thought, just like what you have put up, that, well, okay, it's all officials. How could you convince us that you will be very fair? So I have accepted the view put to us, and so later on, we will introduce a committee stage amendment to this bill to allow for the chief executive to appoint a number of community leaders to become members of the Eligibility Review Committee. Now, being principal officials or being the chief executive, we have to face potential conflict of interest day in and day out. Okay? Every Tuesday when I convene the EXCO meetings, myself, members of the government team, and also non-official members of the Executive Council, they have to face possible, potential conflict of interest. So we have a very robust declaration system. Okay. So we will have to declare if we perceive that there will be a conflict of interest. And I may as well make this very clear, just in case there are more unhelpful speculations. It is true that if there is an incumbent chief executive who wants to seek re-election to serve a second term, then he or she will be put in a position as chairing the National Security Committee to form an opinion on whether in a CE election a candidate fulfills the qualification. So that could be seen as a more direct conflict of interest because the CE will be in a position that he or she could disqualify other candidates. So I would make it a rule, not in the legislation, but I will make it very clear now, and I will say it very clearly in Legislative Council through my colleagues, that it is my view that any incumbent chief executive, if he or she is seeking another term through election, in other words, he or she will contest in the coming chief executive election, then this incumbent chief executive should not get himself or herself involved in that particular discussion at the National Security Committee. But the Eligibility Review Committee has no position for the chief executive. The chief executive only appoints. And if any members of the Eligibility Review Committee, for example, a principal official who wants to contest in a CE election, then well before the nomination period starts, he or she has to resign. So that conflict simply will not arise.
下一條題目。
Next question. Next question, please. The one in dark shirt on the right. Ms. Chief Executive of Hong Kong EJ. Blank ballot. Casting blank ballot and invalid ballot. There is no criminal liability. Now you're turning this into a criminal offense. What legal basis do you have? How do you think that this kind of act would affect the election engineering? Or is it the case that the government want to have regard to its own face, and you want to keep the legitimacy, therefore you make this proposal? And also CERC, you said that community leaders will be included, that the CERC will be involved, will get access to the National Security Department's information. How can you ensure that the arrangement of having a community leader in the committee will not conflict with the NSL? Elections are upon us. Do you have any candidates in mind for the CRC? What criteria do you have for appointment? Do you make appointment in accordance with the ranking or in accordance with the ability, or what? Let me address the CRC question, and Roy can take the question about election because he's more familiar with election arrangement and the corrupt and illegal activities. True, any member sitting on the CERC is likely to get access to the national security information. That's why I proposed at the outset that this committee should be composed of principal officials. Well, you can say that we've listened to public views. We want to increase or enhance the credibility. We want to have people who are held in high esteem in the community to be part of the CRC to facilitate the work of the committee. The bill doesn't have the provision there, but if we get the support of the Bills Committee, we are only too delighted to move an amendment for this to happen. Now, they may get access to the national security information, so we have to be very cautious in identifying the candidate, and these people will have to be subject to national security vetting first. We have to have full faith in them fulfilling the Patriot requirement. And the POs on the CRC are appointed by the CPG, and I don't rule out the possibility that these individuals may be may have to be submitted to CPG for record. Under the Basic Law, there are certain provisions which require submission for record, and this is to highlight the importance of these positions. Now, after the National Security Department has given the input, do we need to give too much information to the CRC so that the members do not have to get access to too much of the national security information? That can be considered, but we have to identify people in Hong Kong who get the trust of the mainland authorities and also who are credible people. It would not be too difficult, but we have to be careful in the operation itself. Blank votes. In this local legislative exercise, we are amending the legislation to prohibit people from openly inciting others not to vote or to cast blank or invalid votes. Earlier, at the Electoral subcommittee, we've already stated this. We noticed that in the community out there are people who are engaging in these kind of acts in order to undermine the election or in order to make the election illegitimate. So in the amendment exercise, we're going to be proposing provisions to stop these kind of manipulating and undermining acts. It's not the case that we don't have any faith in the elections themselves. There are acts like this in the community, and people are engaging in these acts to incite other people. So we want to make the amendments to make sure that the elections will not be manipulated or undermined. SJ? And let me add, inciting voters not to vote or to cast blank or invalid votes, the penalty is 3 years custodial sentence. I'd like to add that as a citizen, we do have the civic duty to cast our vote. So that's why we're urging the voters to take part and to cast their ballots. Second, in relation to the amendment exercise arising from Annexes 1 and 2, we do need to take measures to prohibit acts that manipulate and undermine elections. In the March 11 decisions and Annexes 1 and 2, we have been given this very important obligation. Now we have to understand that the whole purpose of the March 11 decision is to improve the election system. So we have to look at this from this perspective. Also, in terms of legal principles, we have to make sure that our elections are held in an open, fair, and honest manner. And the elections will be free of any corrupt and illegal conducts. So we do have existing legislation to address these issues. But as the Secretary said a moment ago, when we identify certain situations that will be detrimental to the elections, we have to act in accordance with the obligation under Annexes 1 and 2. And if anything, if we spot these irregularities, we have to legislate to make sure that the elections will be held in an open, fair, and honest manner so that everybody will be able to exercise and discharge their civic duty.
Next question. The one in a white shirt. I'm from Now TV. First of all, I'd like to ask about the proposed offense of inciting others not to cast blank votes. It mentions here that there is a word openly. What is the definition if someone on a website appeals to family and friends not to vote? Does it constitute an offense? And you mentioned that if an incumbent CE seeks re-election, then they will have to be excused from discussions by the National Security Committee. Well, why doesn't the incumbent chief executive resign from the membership of the Committee for Safeguarding National Security? As I've explained before, this is one more step taken to take away the perception, especially in an upcoming election that involves an incumbent chief executive. We have complete confidence in our system. As I said, I'm the chief executive. Every day I have to consider whether there is any conflict of interest in matters I deal with every day, whether it is in the EXCO discussion or in the consideration of the honors list. If, for fear of accusations of poor perception or potential conflict of interest, the chief executive will have to be excused from everything, then I don't think that is in line with the accountability requirement. Every day we have to deal with conflict of interest. We follow the procedure and the established mechanism, say, for example, declaration of interest. There are a dozen members in the National Security Committee other than the chief executive. And the chief executive is not a member or chairman of the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee. I am involved in the drafting of this bill. I'd like to make it loud and clear that on the issue of conflict of interest, and in order to get recognition from the general public, this is a necessary act. But sometimes it is not major enough to have to be written in the law, so it can be dealt with by way of a rule. If an incumbent chief executive wants to run in the election for the second term, but it has happened before, if all the duties are to be relieved of the incumbent chief executive, that is simply not pragmatic. Well, for principal officials, they have to resign if they decide to run for the chief executive, as I've done. For incumbent chief executive, if they want to seek re-election, then they can continue to carry out the duties of a chief executive. Of course, it goes without saying that they will have to very clearly separate chief executive duties from non-chief executive duties. We are a common law jurisdiction. We have laws to deal with the matters you've mentioned. Not everything has to be written into our statute law. In our statute, you talk about the definition of openly. The law clearly states what defines openly. First, the person who engages in this act, whether they are in a public place or not. The definition of openly may be met. There are three situations. First, any form of communications that includes speaking, showing clips, and any materials that are recorded or documented, say, for example, emails. The second one is that a deed that can be observed by the public. For example, is someone at their home, but in front of a huge, but outside that person's window there is a banner hung appealing to people not to vote or to cast invalid votes. That is, that can be plainly seen by the public. It also, these acts includes a gesture, attire, display of banners, flags, emblems. And the third one is dissemination of any materials via the public or to the public. If it is by way of an electronic means, then definitely that box is ticked. Next question. The lady in black at the front.
China Morning Post. A follow-up question on why is it unlawful to encourage others not to vote? Some tricky scenarios here. What if voters find no favorable candidates in their own constituencies? Can they simply express their view and ask their friends in the neighborhood not to vote? And if there are only 2 candidates in one constituency, can a candidate simply ask voters not to support his rivals? The second question, regarding the vetting committee, as the National Security Police are given power to conduct background checks, how do you address the concerns over the absence of checks and balance of the police? Will any intelligence collected by the National Security Police in the vetting process be used to accuse the potential candidates of violating the national security law? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the second question, and maybe Secretary for Constitution and Mainland Affairs could help again on this election matter about inciting people not to vote and so on. Now, the world has changed, especially for Hong Kong in terms of national security. Since 30th of June last year, we have a national security law. And the national security law is a piece of national legislation promulgated for implementation in Hong Kong. And by definition, not only in Hong Kong, but in worldwide, national security are top confidential matters. So the law provides that the designated department, the National Security Department in the Hong Kong Police Force, has been given certain powers and responsibilities. And the responsibility includes the conducting assessment on national security grounds. So they have to fulfill their duty. And on this occasion, a part of this duty is to provide input on a fact-finding basis, to provide input to the National Security Committee, which will then form an opinion on whether a certain candidate, based on the facts presented by the police, is qualified or not qualified to run in any election. And if he or she is not qualified, that on national security grounds, then an opinion will be passed on to the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee for a final decision to be made by the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee. And the work of a National Security Committee, and by definition, the work of the National Security Department in the police force is not to be disclosed. So similarly, I don't think anybody will abridge the law to try to disclose information collected by the police for this particular purpose, for other purposes, in which case I'm sure that they will be abridging the law in other aspects. Roy?
Yeah. If I make first comment on the second hypothetical scenario of the reporter, it's about whether it's legal to ask your friend or other people not to support any candidate or one of the 2 candidates, as you have mentioned, in an election. It's actually perfectly legal to do so, as long as when you are, it's actually in the existing legislation, when you are trying to do something to promote the election of a candidate, or to prevent another candidate from being elected, what you're doing is what we call election advertisement. And you have to count your expenses. So if you're doing it for a candidate, then all the expenses you have incurred in doing the promotion for that particular candidate or against another candidate would be counted as part of the election expenses of that candidate. That's one point. The second point is if you're doing it without the consent of the candidate you want to promote, then you are probably committing an offense. Without the permission of the candidate and then incur expense on his behalf is an offense under the existing law. The first hypothetical situation which you've mentioned, whether it's legal to ask your friend not to vote or to cast an invalid vote or to destroy a ballot paper in the polling station. The last scenario is actually, again, a criminal offense. So it all depends on the factual situation of your behavior and whether you are doing it in some form of organized activity. It's a matter of evidence for the court. Thank you.
下一條提問，左手。
Next, the one in grey, RTHK. Now for casting blank votes and so on, will you look at the turnout rate by comparison with previous elections as the yardstick, and that in the election committee there are so many pro-establishment members. Do you think that this is enough in terms of participation? First, as to the turnout rate for any election, it would be hinging on many factors. We cannot say that if the turnout rate is high, it is a successful election. Now, it would be a successful election if someone gets elected. So the views vary from person to person. We're encouraging the members of the public to discharge the civic duty and be concerned about who gets elected into the council and cast their vote in accordance with the right conferred upon them by the legislation. And the SCMA will do a lot of publicity to encourage people to exercise their civic responsibilities. It's early days now. As I said, we have been ravaged by the pandemic, and it also depends on the arrangement on the polling date. So we cannot say that the system is good enough with a certain turnout rate. We are not talking about one single election or few rounds of election. We want to have the institution that will ensure peace, a peaceful environment in Hong Kong. In order to have a peaceful environment, our electoral system must be in line with one country, two systems. So the candidates have to be patriots, and this is not too demanding. By patriots, we mean supporting the Hong Kong SAR as an inalienable part of the mainland, and also upholding the basic law and bearing allegiance to the Hong Kong SAR. I will not do anything that will be undermining the sovereignty and national interests. So we are asking the candidates to be patriots. This is point number one. Second, if you ask me such a specific question, even participation and broadly representative, I can assure you that under this system, with the composition of these different elements, we can fulfill all these principles. Let's take a sector, for instance. If in the subsector we have people who cannot reflect the weight of different people in the community, it will not be good enough. We want to have even participation. We want we have a 3-year requirement, and that would enable us to manifest these requirements. We cannot simply look at these from the establishment or non-establishment angles when we look at the members in the election committee. Next, please. The lady in front, please. My first question is, now with these revamped geographical constituencies, can you guarantee that all the candidates taking part are patriots? And for the NT North, have you taken into account the development of the GPA development? Hong Kong West includes the southern part, the central and western, and the islands of Hong Kong. Toowoomba and Chek Lap Kok are linked, and there will be greater and greater cooperation. Why don't you amalgamate Toowoomba and the islands? For the delineation of geographical constituencies, we haven't taken into account all these other factors. Obviously, they have to be geographically linked. We cannot have the constituencies split up in the north and the south. And we cannot take into account the infrastructural links and all the other developments, and also the room for building developments and so on. We take into account all the objective factors, population distribution, and the linkage, and so on. Subsuming the islands under Hong Kong West, I can ask Roy to supplement in a moment. Now, with this improved system, we hope that all candidates, be it in the CE election or EC election, or the geographical constituencies, they have to fulfill the patriot requirement. Now, to achieve this, we have the Candidate Eligibility Review Committee, and we have the National Security Committee, which is assisting the CERC. For 20-odd years since the reunification, we didn't have the national security law. Before the handover, we had the national the vetting work, but after the handover, we didn't have these kind of vetting process. Now we have the National Security Committee, and I have full confidence that the candidates are going to be patriots. Now you may say that someone may slip through and they fulfill the patriot requirements, and they manage to make it into their seat, their post. Now we are actually dealing with this issue. When a candidate has been elected into the council, if there is any acts that in breach of the oath, like upholding basic law and pledging allegiance and so on, we have another piece of legislation that is being scrutinized by the Electoral that will address this particular issue. Roy, the constituencies. Thank you, Chief Executive. If you've read Appendix H of the Electoral Brief, Central and Western Southern District in Islands, and they will form the Hong Kong Island West constituency. The population will be 662,000. In each district, we want to reach 760,000. Now, for Hong Kong Island West, it is 9.3% lower than this base figure, and this is the furthest away from the base figure. But this is also in line with the delineation criteria, that is plus or minus 15%. The lady asked about the possibility of taking away the islands and end up with just the central and western and the southern district, and it will be a 34% deviation from the criteria that will be going against the criteria for delineation adopted by the EAC. As the chief executive said, we want to have even distribution in the constituencies.
Next question. The one in white at the back. I'm from cable TV. I'd like to ask, say, if someone thinks that the review committee's decision is biased, shouldn't there be an appeal mechanism instead of making that decision final? How do you make sure that the decision is error-free or partial? Well, for grassroots groups, we see that there are federations of new territories, Kowloon, etc. How come there are so few? What criteria are there in the selection of these grassroots associations? Would you consider other associations? The function of the review committee is to decide whether candidates are eligible. There are a number of requirements. One is whether there is any criminal conviction, whether one is a permanent resident, whether the age is eligible, whether there are certain breaches that prevents that person from running in an election. If the review committee thinks that a candidate is not, well, in the current setup, if a candidate is deemed unsuitable, then judicial review can be taken out. In a setup of the review committee, if a candidate is deemed to not able to uphold the basic law and to be unable to swear allegiance to the Hong Kong SAR, as the two annexes said, that such a decision is not subject to any legal proceedings. Principal officials and members to be appointed into the review committee know that they have to meet a public expectation. We will make sure that there will not be any perception that one can decide decide for everyone else in the committee. We will be happy to answer questions on a different platform. In order to make sure that there is broad representation, equal participation, and a balance of interest, we have added 7 subsectors, one of which is grassroots associations. We have garnered a lot of recognition and support, because if you're just a grassroots association, it will not be easy for you to get represented in our proposal. How do we identify these associations? The NPCSC has said that this improvement exercise is to come up with a proposal that is in line with Hong Kong's situation and something that will ensure that Hong Kong will develop in line with all the principles. One of them is to have sufficient affiliation with with a group. So grassroots associations will have to have close affiliation with grassroots families. How many associations are there as members, and whether they can implement the principle of patriots administering Hong Kong. In relation to affiliation, we're talking about 3 geographical areas: Hong Kong, Kowloon, and New Territories. We're talking about federations, New Territories federations, Kowloon federations, and Hong Kong Island federations. They have a lot of satellite groups reaching out to grassroots families and youngsters. The second criterion is the representativeness. You can see that they've organized a lot of activities, so there is sufficient representativeness. And they have been operating for a considerable period of time. The third criterion is to implement patriots administering Hong Kong. So these organizations would have never been involved in acts that undermine Hong Kong, undermine national security, collude with external forces. Upon fulfillment of these criteria, they will be eligible to be an association in the subsector. And it applies not just in particular to this subsector, but to other subsectors as well. The gentleman at the back, on the right. I'm from Hong Kong 01. First, functional constituencies in the election committee. You talk about 3 criteria. You talk about continuous operation of 3 years. You said that this is to prevent vote rigging. After the anti-extradition bill in 2019, there are some trade associations and unions that have sprouted up. They will not be eligible. Is that right? You also mentioned about patriots administering Hong Kong. There are some members in this organization. They have been operating for a very long time. Are they eligible? In relation to blank votes, you talk about inciting others to cast blank votes during an election. It's possible that it is a commission of an illegal act. Is it the case that, for people who currently or outside election times, they appeal to others to cast blank votes, have they broken the law? For continuous operation of 3 years, it applies to organizations not on the list. If they want to become eligible to be a body under the subsector, then they will have to continuously operate after they have obtained the eligibility. This is an objective criterion. It's not for me to say. It is perfectly objective. But there is a date. You have made the registration and you have since then been continuously operating for 3 years. Then you're eligible. That is not an excessive requirement. I have already explained about the common grounds, the common factors. That is, what organizations can become eligible bodies in the various subsectors. For social welfare, you see that there are some representative organizations. We have CSS. There is also a registration council for social workers. You should know about the nature of these organizations. I think you have not read the provision If you have, then half of the questions about casting blank votes will not have to be asked. This is in relation to during an election period, not other times. The second criterion is the word openly. And the third one is that all the cases will be decided individually. Fourthly, there is a defense. There may be a reasonable excuse to conduct the act. It is inappropriate for me to decide when you give me a hypothetical question, because it is for the court, but not me, to interpret the law. And prosecution is not my job either. It is the independent function of the Department of Justice. For the provisions, we may have a chance to discuss a bit more later.
The one in white. We'll speak up a little bit. Ta Kung Pao. 2 questions. Now, the new geographical constituencies, will this affect the election expenses ceiling? And will the new system enhance the quality of the candidates? Well, the expenses, they will be adjusted in accordance with inflation, is your question. The expense ceiling doesn't include any other factors other than inflation. This has always been the case. I remember the accumulated inflation has been about 10%. This is the ceiling. One may not necessarily hit the ceiling. The quality of the candidates with an improved system, we may be able to elect the rational people. It doesn't necessarily mean to say that the quality will go up. Now, the governing team is the layer with the first responsibility. In order to enhance the governing quality, we need to have the talents in the governing team. Of course, we also want to have talents, good talents in the Electoral that in turn will enhance the governance quality. In the March 11 decision, the CPG highlighted 5 objectives. One of them is to enhance the quality of governance. First, the executive branch, if it faces a Electoral which has the power to earmark funding and approve legislation, if this council is engaging in filibustering and all kinds of activities, they're not good enough. If we can stop all these, we will be able to enhance the quality of governance. Electoral has been put back on the right track, and we have enacted a lot of bills, and we have a lot of funding endorsed. I think we need to do a better job now. Second, because of this improved electoral system, the political environment is improved. I'm sure there are a lot more capable talents who are prepared to take part in the electoral work, be it the EC to elect the chief executive and the Electoral members, or indeed they are prepared to take part in the election themselves. And because the overall political environment has been improved, I'm sure that there will be more people who are willing to join the executive branch to become POs. This is my analysis, and this is also the observation that I have as to whether this is going to be panning out as expected, we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see until when the 3 sets of elections are finished. Stand news. That the voter registration. Some said that some are not happy with this change. Can people still cancel their registration? Will there be any deadline for doing so? Now, there is an offense of inciting other people to cast blank votes. If you end up with a lot of blank votes and invalid votes, will this election going to be illegitimate? Will this be an election that reflects public displeasure? And also the electronic poll register, who is developing this system? Will there be any outsourced contractor that will be responsible for the development, and how much progress have you achieved? Will there be any electronic voting? Will there be any mainland Hong Kong people in mainland who will be allowed to vote? SCMA. Let me take the question about the blank votes. That the lady asked whether the credibility will be diminished if there are many blank votes. In answer to the previous question, I said that some people attempted to delegitimize the election, and that's why they were inciting the casting of blank votes. I'm not suggesting that the credibility will be diminished. As the CE said, there are many factors affecting the turnout rate. It may not be just down to one factor. If people openly incite other voters to cast blank ballot or to not to vote, this is indeed an attempt to undermine the credibility of the election or manipulate the election. These kind of acts should be regulated. So in accordance with Annexes 1 and 2, we are putting in place these provisions to prohibit these acts. As to the cancellation of voter registration, I turn to Roy. Now you've seen the publicity about the deadline of May the 2nd. This is for the registration of new voters. As the chief executive said, in this amendment exercise, those who are affected will be given a new deadline, and that is the 5th of July. The lady asked whether a voter can cancel the registration. Yes, the answer is yes, and there is no time limit. You also asked about the electronic poll register. This will be undertaken by the EAC and the REO, and they have already completed the tendering, and the system design and security are being looked at the moment. In this amendment exercise, in order for us to use the electronic system, we will have to make sure that the security of the system. Anybody who is trying to sabotage the issuance of the electronic slips will be an illegal conduct. You mentioned the polling stations in these 3 sets of election. We talked about having polling stations outside of Hong Kong for Hong Kong eligible people to cast their votes outside of Hong Kong. This is a complicated issue, and after this exercise, we will look into this, but for these 3 sets of election, this will not be happening. As to whether this is going to be happening in future, it all depends on the technical issues.
I'm from TVB. First question. Casting blank votes. Can you in detail explain how it undermines an election? Have you drawn reference from practices in other governments? If not, what have you referred to as a basis? Let me reiterate that to vote or not is your right. We're talking about incite others to vote, to cast blank or invalid votes by way of a public activity to undermine an election. It is mentioned in Annexes 1 and 2, and we're expected to take action to prevent others from undermining an election. It doesn't target an individual. It's your right to vote or not. But if a person openly incites voters to do anything that undermines an election, then it will be caught in a proposed offense. If there are no other supplements, that's the end of today's press conference. Thank you.